This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Telly Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. China pledges $50 billion to Africa, with President Xi calling ties with the continent the best in history. But how equal is the partnership? Over in Russia, President Putin presiding over the Eastern Economic Forum, saying he's always been ready for peace talks with Ukraine and naming China as one of several mediators in potential discussions. Japan and Australia set to boost Air Force links with new agreements and training drills, a move seen as a counterbalance to China's growing military might. And people in southern China are bracing or preparing for the most powerful storm in nearly a decade, forcing schools to shut and flights to cancel or delay. And Europe's reliance on cheap Chinese drugs set to increase as a local manufacturer phases out the production of key ingredients. Ahead on the bulletin, India's leader Narendra Modi gets an official welcome at Singapore's Parliament House as he meets Prime Minister Lawrence Wong. Both nations have signed a string of new deals in a bid to strengthen bilateral ties. China has announced a slew of initiatives to deepen cooperation with African nations. President Xi Jinping spoke today at the China-Africa Cooperation Summit in Beijing, and he said his nation's efforts will spearhead modernization of the global south. Among them, $50 billion in financing over the next 3 years for the continent, which is rich in critical minerals and natural resources. CNA's Olivia Song with a report.
Leaders from over 50 African countries are in Beijing for what China has dubbed its biggest diplomatic event in recent years. All eyes on Chinese President Xi Jinping, who took the stage at the Cooperation Summit's opening, hailing ties between his country and the African continent, describing relations as being at its best in history. In his 25-minute speech, the Chinese leader also outlined a plan to deepen cooperation in the next 3 years.
中非共筑现代化之梦，必将掀起全球南方现代化热潮，谱写构建人类命运共同体的崭新篇章。
President Xi said China was willing to work with African nations across a range of areas, from industry to agriculture, infrastructure and trade, pledging also to open up its markets.
中方愿主动单方面扩大市场开放，决定给予包括33个非洲国家在内的所有同中国建交的 最不发达国家100%税目产品零关税待遇，成为实施这一举措的首个发展中大国和世界主要经济体，推动中国大市场成为非洲大机遇。
Another opportunity is in green development, said President Xi, adding that China is ready to launch 30 clean energy projects in Africa and to set up a forum on the peaceful use of nuclear technology. China has been the region's largest trading partner for the last 15 years, and amid its own economic challenges, analysts had expected that President Xi in his speech would make a pitch for African countries to buy more Chinese products, this especially for items that have come under intense scrutiny or face trade restrictions from the West.
Excellence, Monsieur Xi Jinping.
African leaders who took the stage at the summit's opening welcomed China's pledges, even though some have previously raised concerns about a trade imbalance with China. China has not met its target to buy $300 billion in African goods, which was promised 3 years ago.
We can leverage on the technology China have, of course, with support that it provides to Africa, but also China needs Africa to continue to expand and grow its economy.
It's not only the president of South Africa, President Xi himself has indicated that that trade deficit must be closed, and that's why he has committed to also do on 100 items tariff-free trade so that South Africa can improve its exports to China.
Mr. Xi said China will provide $50 billion in financing to the region over the next 3 years. These comprise credit lines, assistance in various forms, and investment in Africa by Chinese enterprises, also promising to create at least 1 million jobs. According to Boston University data, over $180 billion in loans has been disbursed by China from the year 2000 to 2023. While the loans have helped build infrastructure in countries under China's Belt and Road Initiative, some analysts have raised concerns about it posing a debt trap, although this has been refuted by China repeatedly. Olivia Xiong, CNA, Beijing.
Well, earlier we spoke with Eric Olander, editor-in-chief of the China Global South Project, and he talked about the Chinese president's key message in his speech to African leaders.
Trade levels are certainly very strong. So last year we did $282 billion. We're on a track to exceed that. But remember that the trade between China and Africa is not spread evenly or equally, and it's highly distorted in terms of concentrated in about 5 or 6 resource exporting countries. So again, when we speak about Africa, this is a region of 55 countries, so it becomes very difficult to simplify into one unit. This is one country, one continent. But that being said, there is a lot of alignment today between the priorities of African countries and what China wants to achieve. We saw that on Monday in the bilateral state visit with Cyril Ramaphosa from South Africa and Chinese President Xi Jinping, where the Chinese called out in the joint statement, praising South Africa for bringing the case against Israel in support of Gaza to the International Criminal Justice, the ICJ, so the International Court of Justice. So you see that ideological alignment. You also, in Xi's speech, heard a lot of references to modernization. This is something that is central to China's own development story. And then Xi was also very quick to, criticize the West right up front in the beginning. And there's a lot of frustration in Africa towards the West and a lot of disillusionment to the fact that the U.S. and Europe, for the most part, are distracted by wars in the Middle East and in Russia, and increasingly here in Southeast Asia with the South China Sea as well. And Africa has fallen off as a priority. So China's taking full advantage of this and deepening its engagement. And I think that was the message that Xi sought to give today, and I think he was successful.
And I will have more insights on Mr. Xi's speech and the summit a little later in the bulletin when we speak with Bates Gill, Senior Fellow for Asian Security at the National Bureau of Asian Research. Now, Russia's war with Ukraine among key topics at the annual Eastern Economic Forum held at the far eastern city of Vladivostok. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin says that he could have nations friendly to Moscow act as peace mediators.
Мы с уважением относимся к нашим друзьям, партнерам, которые, я считаю, искренне заинтересованы в решении всех вопросов, связанных с этим конфликтом. Это прежде всего Китайская Народная Республика, Бразилия, Индия. Я постоянно в контакте с нашими коллегами по этому вопросу. И у меня нет сомнения в том, что руководители этих стран, у нас с ними доверительные отношения, искренне стремятся к тому, чтобы помочь разобраться во всех деталях этого сложного процесса, который, безусловно, я хочу это напомнить.
The four-day summit aims to broaden the economic appeal of Russia's Far Eastern areas, and it also seeks to boost cooperation with countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Mr. Putin covered a range of topics ranging from economic and political issues to the upcoming U.S. elections.
Что касается фаворитов, то не нам это определять. Это все-таки выбор американского народа. И, я уже говорил, у нас, фаворитом, если можно так сказать, был действующий президент, господин Байден. Вот его сняли с гонки, но он рекомендовал всем своим сторонникам поддержать госпожу Харрис. Вот и мы тоже так сделаем, будем ее поддерживать. Это, во-первых. А во-вторых...
Раз завещали, значит, надо, да?
Вот. А во-вторых, она так выразительно и заразительно смеется, что это говорит о том, что у нее все хорошо.
And for more, Dasha Chekov, she joins us live now in Moscow. So, Dasha, tell us, how does Mr. Putin plan to leverage these talks with a delegation at this year's summit?
Well, certainly the understanding is that Moscow does want to bring more investments to its Far East, and therefore the Russian president has devoted a whole bunch of his speech talking about how speedy is the development of Russia's Far East, and that should serve as a blueprint for the development of other regions in Russia. And for that, Russia does want to attract, including foreign investment. He also has spoken about the development of the economy, saying that the economy should be developed in a way that it is technologically sovereign, that it doesn't rely on anybody else, and that there are high qualified specialists who are working in the economy. And this is paramount for the development of Russia's economy, as well as for the development of the economy of the wider region. He was speaking about the countries of Asia Pacific, of Asia, and also talking about the global south, suggesting that this is the region where the global GDP is, where the fastest growth in GDP is observed at the moment. He said that was actually the reason why the trade was getting to the so-called process of de-dollarization. And we've heard that the region does need to get and ensure the leadership in the economic development. We also have heard the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, saying that the approach to the economy should be more humane, attentive and compassionate to the welfare of the people. So a lot has been devoted to the ways how this region could be getting to the economic prosperity in a way that benefits the people of the region. Meanwhile, President Vladimir Putin has also been talking about Russian gas, saying that Russia is increasing the supplies of gas to the Asian region, while this process, he said, is not actually linked to the conflict in Ukraine solely. We are also seeing that Germany has not allowed the supplies of Russian gas, and Ukraine has decided to block the transit of Russian gas. So a lot has been discussed. But the prime focus and the prime message that we have heard in this panel discussion was that the development of the economy is going to serve the welfare of the people. And this economy and this economic development should have the prime focus on the people and how this economy is meeting the needs of the changing world.
Right, Dasha, and just picking up on what Mr. Putin had said about friendly nations like China, India, Brazil, potentially being mediators for Ukraine war talks, for instance. Is there room for mediation for this?
Well, interestingly, Moscow says it has never rejected the possibility of a negotiated solution to the conflict in Ukraine, even though we've heard the harsh rhetoric from the Russian officials over the course of the past weeks since the start of Ukrainian incursion of Russia's Kursk region. The understanding is that Moscow has never rejected those talks, and even now it is welcoming all the mediation efforts by any country. However, Moscow does stress that the two sides have been really close to reaching an agreement, and that was back in spring 2022 when the Istanbul agreements were actually almost signed by the delegations of both sides. And the understanding in Russia is that it is the Western countries that prevented that from happening. So for Russia, it does seem to be the case that Moscow will welcome any sort of mediation. But in the meantime, it will rely on its own and primarily on its military while achieving the goals of what it calls its special military operation in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the foreign guests to the Eastern Economic Forum have all stressed that the conflict in Ukraine is affecting the entire world. We've heard the we've heard the representatives there saying that the supply chains have been interrupted, that they are seeing the shockwaves, they are seeing the high inflation. So it is in the interest of the global south, including to stop this conflict in Ukraine.
Thanks very much for that update. Dasha Chekov speaking to us from Moscow. Meantime, we turn our focus to Southeast Asia. Pope Francis is presiding over a mass at the Gelora Bung Karno Stadium in Jakarta.
Dei criteri di questo mondo, dei giudizi terreni. Sempre abbiamo bisogno di una luce che venga dall'alto, a illuminare i nostri passi.
Well, you're looking at live pictures from the stadium. Some 80,000 Catholics are estimated to be in attendance. Well, also today, the 87-year-old pontiff held an interreligious meeting at the Istiklal Mosque and met with beneficiaries from charitable organizations. Well, do stay with us here on CNA for our coverage of the pontiff's 11-day Asia-Pacific trip, with stops in Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, and here in Singapore. And you can also track the latest updates on his visit on our website, cna.asia. Now, China, in response to Japan and Australia's agreement to boost military ties, says that defense partnerships should promote peace and not be used to target third parties. The Chinese Foreign Ministry adds that the focus should instead fall on maintaining regional peace and stability. Well, earlier today, Tokyo's top diplomat said like-minded countries must stick together. Japan and Australia's foreign and defense ministers held their so-called 2+2 talks at an old army fort near Melbourne. Well, they struck deals on Air Force cooperation and military exercises and promised joint help for the Philippine Coast Guard, but without concrete details on what that will look like.
Cooperation has never been greater than what it is on this day, and there is an extensive agenda of outcomes which we have put out coming out of today's meeting. But I want to highlight four. Today we have agreed to enhance our air engagement with greater people-to-people links, more training, greater exercises between our two air forces.
特に東シナ海および南シナ海におきます力による一方的な現状変更の試みに強く反対するとともに、台湾海峡の平和と安定の重要性で一致をいたしました。
Our Sydney correspondent Roger Maynard has more to add. Let's listen.
This was clearly a key opportunity for both sides to discuss some of the most important strategic issues facing the Indo-Pacific. And from what we heard at today's press conference, no stone was left unturned. Australia's Defence Minister Richard Marles made it clear that the meeting had taken place in a context where both nations had never been closer. One of the most significant results from today's talks was an agreement to enhance air engagement with greater people-to-people links and training exercises between the two air forces. Next year, for the first time, Australia will participate in Exercise Orient Shield. This is the largest land exercise which exists between the United States and Japan, and for the first time next year, Australia will also participate. Mr. Marles revealed. This was all part of a broader theme in which both sides looked at opportunities whereby each country, through the natural engagement they have with the United States, can involve each other in their activities. But some of the strongest words came from the Japanese Defense Minister Kiya Minoru, who referred to two incidents last month involving China. Once on August the 26th, when PLA aircraft reportedly invaded Japanese airspace, and another on the 30th of August when the Chinese Navy apparently cruised into Japanese territorial waters. Well, now, China has contested these claims, insisting it has no intention of invading sovereign airspace, and on the other occasion, a Chinese vessel was merely exercising its right to transit under international maritime law. However, the Japanese minister said they'd shared very strong concern over these incidents, and for the East China Sea and the South China Sea, we've expressed our strong opposition to any attempts to unilaterally change the status quo by force or by coercion, he added. Roger Maynard, CNA, Sydney.
Time now for a short break, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, JP Morgan Chase joining global investment banks in downgrading their recommendation on Chinese stocks amid underwhelming policy support. Calling all K-pop and K-drama fans, South Korea has set its sights on building a local version of Hollywood, hoping to draw in more tourists. Hello again. Good to have you in East Asia Tonight. It is now time for your business news with none other than Roland Lim. So, Roland, tell us all about Europe risking possibly becoming even more reliant on China for its cheap pharmaceutical imports?
That's the way it seems to be headed, Oteli. And that's as a major pharmaceutical manufacturer, that's Euro API, is phasing out production of 13 medical ingredients. The company says the cuts are necessary because of stagnant markets and increasing competition from Asian players. The Paris-linked Euro API is closing plants, cutting production of many active pharmaceutical ingredients or APIs. Now, these are used in common medicine, including the painkiller paracetamol, as well as antibiotics. Many APIs and their precursor chemicals, such as the ones used for diabetic medication, are only manufactured at one European plant now. In contrast, that precursor chemical is made in at least 5 sites in China. Germany blames the local drug reimbursement scheme for falling production as well as prices in Europe. Health insurance companies' tenders are won by the cheapest providers, causing drug ingredient prices in Europe to plunge. And the price drop has slashed output at the end of the 90s. Europe produced 2/3 of the APIs it needed, but now the region imports 2/3 from Asia, mainly China and India. Now, nearly 40% of antibiotic APIs and 30% of oncology APIs are produced outside of the European Union. The dependence on China is also strong for diabetes medication and drugs for high blood pressure. South Korea plans to develop an entertainment hub by 2035 that'll rival Hollywood to draw global fans of K-pop and K-drama. Spanning over 3 square kilometers, the project will focus on film, TV, music, and the arts. The hub will include content production facilities, specialized entertainment schools, and full-scale replicas of historical palaces to support drama production. South Korea's entertainment sector, which generated $114 billion in revenue last year, is a key driver for future growth. The government is seeking private investment, particularly in telecom, internet, and financial services to support the hub's development. A $75 million fund will be established with foreign investors, and a large-scale Hallyu pop music festival is planned for next summer. South Korea is hoping its version of Hollywood will attract overseas tourists, particularly from China and Japan. The government has yet to choose or name a site for the hub. Asia's 4th largest economy drew some 10 million visitors the first 8 months of this year, substantially higher year on year. However, this is still below pre-pandemic levels due to fewer Chinese tourists who still need travel visas. Talks are underway with both China and Japan to boost tourism. Remember, South Korea aims to reach 30 million visitors annually over the next few years. Nippon Steel says it has not been informed of U.S. government plans to block its proposed purchase of U.S. steel. This was in reaction to media reports suggesting that U.S. President Joe Biden is set to block the proposed takeover amid growing bipartisan political opposition to the $14.9 billion deal. A media note released from the company this morning downplayed national security concerns, saying it had been clear with the U.S. since the regulatory process began that the transaction doesn't create any such problems for the U.S. government. U.S. Steel has warned that thousands of jobs will be put at risk in the battleground state of Pennsylvania if the deal fails. Analysts say it could also chill foreign investment in the U.S. Greater China markets ending the day mixed. Both the Shanghai and Shenzhen did edge higher. Hang Seng in Hong Kong, though, falling for a 4th straight day. Oil producers' main drag, although property developers did put on some gains. The outlook for Chinese stocks staying gloomy, with JP Morgan Chase ditching its buy recommendation. Heightened volatility around the looming U.S. elections, growth headwinds, and, quote, underwhelming policy support, leading the investment bank to downgrade its call on Chinese equities to neutral from overweight. JP Morgan's downgrade follows similar moves by UBS and Nomura these past weeks. Turning to the Japanese markets, the yen continues to firm against the dollar as Japanese workers' real wages rose for the 2nd straight month in July. Now, this underscores the Bank of Japan's view that rising pay will support consumption. It also keeps the central bank on track for another potential rate hike this year. And remember, stronger yen weighing on the earnings outlook of exporters. The Nikkei 225 fell 1%, automakers, chip counters leading the losers. And that is the business update. Oteli.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Well, we're going to go for another short break, but coming up on East Asia tonight, southern China braces for the arrival of Super Typhoon Yagi in what could be the most powerful storm to to hit the region in nearly a decade. And Japan confirms the detention of one of its citizens in Belarus for flouting local laws. China promises Africa more than $50 billion in financing as President Xi Jinping hails ties with the continent as their best period in history. Russian President Putin says he is always ready for peace talks with Ukraine and has named China as one of several mediators in potential discussions. Japan and Australia set to boost Air Force links with new agreements and training drills, a move seen as a counterbalance to China's growing military might. Beijing's pledge to help African nations in industry, infrastructure, trade and investment occurred at China's biggest diplomatic event in years, while he's pledged to lead efforts to modernize the global south as they roll out tens of billions in funding in the next 3 years. Well, let's now bring in Dr. Bates Gill, Senior Fellow for Asian Security at the National Bureau of Asian Research, and he is joining us from Geneva. Well, good to have you in East Asia tonight, Dr. Gill. First, I just want to touch on the theme of building a high-level China-Africa community with a shared future. But help us understand this. Can a shared future be achieved when one partner is this economic giant and you have the other as a continent that is seeking development?
The term community of shared future is a sort of catch-all phrase that has been one of the signatures of Xi Jinping's foreign policy over the last many years. And it's simply intended, I think, to present a more benign, cooperative vision that Beijing wants the world to understand, and particularly the global South, to take on board and try to find resonance in their common colonial history. Beijing wants African nations to find common ground with Beijing in sort of their joint difficulties they've had with the West in the past, and to so-called build this common future together with China, with, I think, China as a leading figure on the world stage.
Now, on the face of it, Dr. Gill, we have got more than 50 African states against one China. But I guess the question is, how equal is this partnership and who is really benefiting from it?
Well, of course, individually, no African nation can easily size up or be equal, quote unquote, certainly in terms of comprehensive national strength, than China. But China is trying to make the case that the African continent as a whole, and that's why all African leaders, except for maybe one that has relations with Taiwan, are invited to Beijing or gathered together in some of the previous meetings in Africa with China to show a sort of common a solidarity approach. But of course, individually, no, each nation would become highly dependent, and many are highly dependent on China for economic growth, for trade, and of course, in relation to debt. So China clearly has the upper hand. This is a classic example of what I would call a Sino-centric multilateral organization, where China takes the lead in setting the agenda. China takes the lead in creating these enormous diplomatic events, and individual nations have little choice but to go along in agreeing with this vision of China's.
And given China's history of lending practices in Africa, right, how do you see this new $51 billion financing commitment work out? Like any concerns of debt threat for these African nations?
Of course there is. In several cases, it's quite serious, and Beijing understands that. Hence, very little discussion, no public discussion that I've seen of debt relief or the problem of the so-called debt trap that Beijing may pose to certain countries. This new $51 billion commitment, though, is structured interestingly. About 30 billion of it, 210 billion renminbi, is intended to be credit. However, the remainder, around 20 or 21 billion US, is going to be in forms of assistance on the one hand, which I take to be debt-free, supporting programs, technical assistance, military aid, and the like. Also, this $51 billion commitment, about 20 or 21 billion of it, around 11 billion of it or so, is expected to come from Chinese companies. So, she's made this pledge, but it's going to be up to the companies in China to make those investment decisions going forward. It may be difficult to actually see the outcomes of those investments in just 3 short years, which is what the current $51 billion pledge is intended for.
Right. We can clearly see that, China has invested a lot in this summit. They've clearly got big ambitions in Africa. But what sets it apart from other major players like EU, South Korea, and the US? And how is that going to shape China's future?
Well, it's significant. I mean, $51 billion, if it's all realized, is going to be a huge step forward for advancing some of the needs in Africa. China still remains the single largest bilateral donor in Africa by far. And so, in a sense, the closest competitor, if that's the right term for this, comes from multilateral donors like the World Bank or the European Union. And of course, it's the same set of issues that differentiate the two. World Bank lending, other multilateral lending comes with a great deal more of due diligence involved, environmental standards involved, workplace safety and other important requirements are made around those other loans. Some even include, good governance and maybe even some efforts to try and instill greater democratic processes in parts of the continent. So the underlying expectations of the lenders, I think, are different, where Beijing, I think, is much more willing to provide this kind of support with less attention to some of those other requirements that other lenders have.
A great point you've made there. Back to the Global South strategy. We know that China, dealing with all sorts of global pressures like EU and US sanctions, for instance, plus US-led alliances, as you've mentioned, with all these major East Asian economies. How effective is China's focus on the Global South as a key strategy to push back?
Well, I think one thing we need to take note of in this recent summit is the emphasis that's being placed on one of Xi Jinping's major foreign policy initiatives called the Global Security Initiative. And it forms one of the major 10 partnerships that China is pledging with this new summit. And we're going to see through that an enlarged security-related footprint for China in Africa. That's going to come through increased training of police and other security forces in Africa, increased exports of security-related equipment as well as military items to Africa. So I think there we're going to see an expansion. And there, I think it's something that the Europeans, North Americans, other Western countries should be following very, very carefully and closely, because this is something new. In other words, in addition to the traditional emphasis on development on China's part, we're seeing an increase in its interest to expand security-related activities and cooperation with African countries. So that's something new, and it's definitely worth watching. And I think the West is yet to develop effective strategies to try and either counterbalance or at least respond to these developments.
And I will certainly be looking out for that. Thanks so very much for your time and thoughts, Dr. Bates-Gill, Senior Fellow for Asian Security at the National Bureau of Asian Research, speaking to us from Geneva. China is bracing for the arrival of Super Typhoon Yagi. Well, the storm could be the most powerful to hit the country in nearly 10 years. Yagi is forecast to make landfall sometime today or tomorrow, somewhere between Hainan Island and Guangdong Province. Weather officials say the intensifying storm is packing maximum wind speeds of about 210 kilometers per hour. And the storm is expected to bring heavy torrential rains and winds to coastal cities in the southern regions, including Hong Kong and Macau. Hainan has suspended train and boat operations and shut down beaches and tourist sites. Local authorities say all flights will be postponed from tonight until Friday midnight. Now, Hong Kong has raised its third highest typhoon alert this evening. That is the T8 warning as the typhoon barrels closer. Train and bus services in the city also expected to be limited. The weather agency has warned members of the public to stay away from the shoreline. Earlier this week, Tropical Storm Yagi triggered landslides and floods in the Philippines, killing at least 13 people. The severe weather conditions forced thousands of people to flee to safer ground and caused schools and government offices in Manila to shut. South Korea has reported its highest average summertime temperatures this year since national weather observations began in 1973. And it's nearly 2 degrees higher than the historic average at 25.6 degrees Celsius from June to August. Besides record high daytime temperatures, this year's summer was also characterized by severe tropical nights, which are nights when the temperature does not fall below 25 degrees Celsius. South Korea experienced an average of 20.2 days for the June to August period. Well, that's triple the previous average of 6.5 days. The capital, Seoul, shattered records, experiencing 39 consecutive tropical nights this summer. Rainfall was also below average during this period, nearly 18% lesser than usual. Typically, about half of the summer rain would fall during the monsoon period. But this time, more than 3/4 of downpours were concentrated during the wet season, resulting in more clear days and less rainfall outside of the monsoon period. Looks like North Korea has resumed sending more trash-carrying balloons to South Korea overnight. Seoul's military chief says that Pyongyang has been sending hundreds of balloons across the border for 2 consecutive days now.
낙하물은 종이, 플라스틱, 병, 쓰레기 등이며 분석 결과 안전에 위해되는 물질은 없었습니다. 또한 오늘 9시경부터 또다시 풍선을 띄우고 있고 그래서 국민들께서는 적재물 낙하에 주의해 주시고 떨어진 풍선을 발견하면 접촉하지 마시고 가까운 군부대나 경찰서에 신고해 달라는 강조를 좀 드린 바 있습니다.
The two Koreas have been engaging in tit-for-tat escalation along the border since May, with Pyongyang sending hundreds of trash balloons south and Seoul blasting loudspeaker propaganda broadcasts into the north that features K-pop songs. South Korea and its key ally, the U.S., are keeping a close eye on what Pyongyang may be doing near the presidential election in Washington in November. Recently, officials discussed the possibility of Pyongyang carrying out another missile launch, or what would be its 7th nuclear test around the time of the U.S. elections. But the Pentagon says Washington remains firm in defending allies at risk. In other news, Japan has confirmed one of its citizens is in detention in Belarus for what authorities called a breach of local laws. This follows reports by Belarusian media that an alleged Japanese spy was caught operating in the country.
同大使館において邦人保護の観点から領事面会を行うとともに関係者との連絡等できる限りの支援を行っております。また領事面会を通じ同人の健康状態に特段の問題は生じていないということを確認をしております。
Tokyo did not reveal the 50-year-old man's identity or why he was detained in July. But Belarus state TV says he was caught filming military infrastructure, had tried to get details on Chinese investments in Belarus and the situation on the Belarusian border with Ukraine. The man is said to be held in the southeastern city of Gomel, where he reportedly taught Japanese at a university and had organized an exhibition featuring Japanese culture and tradition. China denies that posing a threat to New Zealand's security. The comment was an apparent response to a Tuesday report by New Zealand's spy agency that Beijing-backed groups present a complex intelligence concern. The Chinese embassy in New Zealand, likening the report to a figment of imagination or sheer fabrication, rubbished the claim and called it an effort to sow discord, create fear and foster division between Chinese diaspora and the country. Wellington leveled unusually candid criticisms at Beijing in an annual threat report. While China is among a small number of countries the document singled out for ongoing foreign interference, the report also stresses that it can be difficult to draw conclusive links between interference activities and foreign states. And for more related espionage coverage, you can log on to cna.asia for stories such as this one on China, warning its students to be wary of falling for attractive foreign spies. Coming up in East Asia tonight. Pope Francis holds a mass in Jakarta as he prepares to wrap up his 3-day tour of Indonesia. Plus, India's leader Narendra Modi gets an official welcome at Singapore's Parliament House as he meets Prime Minister Roland Lim. Hello again. Here is a recap of a story we've been tracking today. Pope Francis this hour began presiding over a mass at the Gelora Bung Karno Stadium in Jakarta. And you are looking at live pictures. The pontiff earlier appealed to Catholics in Indonesia to engage with people from other faiths in a message of religious unity. It's the biggest public event of the pontiff's Indonesia trip. Pope Francis earlier arrived for the Mass in a tactical vehicle, flanked by security personnel. The Mass, that started at about 5 p.m. local time, saw crowds gathering well in advance in anticipation of Pope Francis's arrival. More than 80,000 Catholics are in attendance at the stadium. Thousands more are estimated to be crowded outside. The Holy Mass wraps up Pope Francis's visit to Indonesia, the first stop of his 11-day Asia-Pacific tour. Well, also today, the pontiff visited Southeast Asia's largest mosque, the Istiqlal Mosque in Jakarta, where he signed a joint declaration with the Grand Imam to promote peace and protect the environment. Leong Wai-kit with the report.
A tunnel it is, but dark it is not. In fact, quite the opposite. The Pope said this tunnel is illuminated by the friendship between Muslims and Christians.
Di armonica convivenza tra le religioni e le diverse sensibilità spirituali. Questo è un grande dono che ogni giorno siete chiamato a coltivare, perché l'esperienza religiosa sia punto di riferimento di una società fraterna, pacifica e mai motivo di chiusura o scontro.
Pope Francis made several references to the Tunnel of Friendship, a passageway that connects the Istiqlal Mosque to the Our Lady of Assumption Cathedral. 3 to 4 years ago, I was hosted by the Indonesian Foreign Ministry where I visited the mosque, the tunnel and the church, and back then I was told that whenever there are huge events such as, say, Christmas for the Christians, the mosque would open up its doors to allow worshippers to park their cars. Likewise, when the mosque has big events, the church does the same. At the Istiqlal Mosque, the largest in Southeast Asia, Pope Francis signed a joint declaration with the Grand Imam, witnessed by leaders of various faiths. The title of the document is Fostering Religious Harmony for the Sake of Humanity, and it mainly promotes peace and tolerance.
In essa assumiamo con responsabilità le gravi, talvolta drammatiche crisi che minacciano il futuro dell'umanità, in particolare le guerre e i conflitti, purtroppo alimentati anche dalla strumentalizzazione religiosa, ma anche la crisi ambientale, diventata un ostacolo per la crescita e la convivenza dei popoli.
Both the Pope and the Imam put these words into action before they parted ways. The need for more interfaith dialogue was underscored by both Pope Francis and President Joko Widodo on Wednesday. An effort they said would go a long way in countering religious extremism and global conflicts. Pope Francis's visit to Indonesia concludes with a mass at a stadium with more than 70,000 in attendance. On Friday, he heads off to his next stop, Papua New Guinea. Leong Wai-kit, CNA, Jakarta.
And of course, we'll have continued coverage of the Pope's visit to the Asia-Pacific region, including his upcoming trips to Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste and Singapore. You can catch up with the latest on our website, cna.asia. Well, it's day 2 of Narendra Modi's visit to Singapore, and the Indian Prime Minister arrived yesterday at the invitation of his Singaporean counterpart, Lawrence Wong. Now, Mr. Modi's visit comes after his trip to Brunei, as he's looking to deepen ties with Southeast Asia. And this morning, he received an official welcome at Singapore's Parliament House. CNA's Alif Amshah gives us the highlights of the Indian leader's visit.
Well, proceedings of the day kicked off here at the Parliament House where I'm at, and that is where India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi was given an official welcome, one that was quite ceremonial. Of course, Mr. Modi is no stranger to Singapore. He's been here on 4 previous occasions as Prime Minister, and this is his 5th visit to Singapore as head of government, and of course the first since he secured a 3rd term as Prime Minister of India. During the event, he also called on Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, Singapore's Prime Minister. The two leaders exchanged friendly handshakes before they had a closed-door meeting. The two leaders also witnessed the exchange of 4 deals that covered a wide range of areas. One is, of course, the digital economy. So we're talking about greater cooperation in areas such as cybersecurity, the sharing of technical expertise, as well as finding new ways for SMEs between the two countries to work together. Now, the second agreement pertained to boosting cooperation in the field of semiconductors. It aims to support India's growing industry while helping Singapore firms enter and penetrate that market. Now, the visit also comes after the second India-Singapore Ministerial Roundtable held at Shangri-La last month. During that event, leaders of both countries discussed ways to engage and deepen cooperation in a wide range of new and emerging areas. That includes advanced manufacturing as well as the green economy.
Now for your Paralympics update, we begin with athletics at the Stade de France. In the women's T37 100 meters final, China's Wen Xiaoyan breaks the Paralympic record once more. Now that's twice in as many days. She finished the race in 12.52 seconds, shaving off about 0.3 seconds from her timing in yesterday's heats. USA's Taylor Swanson and Jalene Roberts in 2nd and 3rd place. Now this class is for athletes with movement and coordination moderately affected on one side. Algeria's Skander Jamil Ahmani has successfully defended his title in the men's 400 meters T13 race. The 32-year-old crossed the finish line in 47.43 seconds to clinch his 2nd gold in Paris. Japan's Funagaka Ryoto with the silver, while Colombia completes the podium. The T11 to T13 categories are for athletes with vision impairments. And looks like it's another gold for Algeria in the women's shot put F57 event. Safia Jelal broke the Paralympic record that she had set in Tokyo, coming in first with a best throw of 11.56 meters. Compatriot Nassima Saifi took the bronze, while China's Xu Mian won 2nd place. The F57 category is for athletes with limb deficiencies that are not covered by other classes. Japan's Natsuki Wada will go against Russian athlete Elena Prokofyeva later tonight to fight for gold in table tennis WS11 category. Now, the class is designed for athletes with intellectual impairments who meet the sport-specific criteria. Wada edged out Ebru Asa of Turkey 3-2, and Prokofyeva beat Japan's Kanami Furukawa in the semi-finals. Both Asa and Furukawa will bring home a bronze medal, as no third-place match is played for the sport. And China remains at the top of the medal tally with 63 gold medals. Next is Britain with 33 gold and the US in 3rd. And that does it for East Asia tonight this Thursday. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. And you can also find us on Facebook, on YouTube, and on X. Thanks for watching.